session where we have Hudson Bong Ekwoge. He'll be talking about FinTech blueprint on AWS. So Hudson, if you're with us, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Bashir. Thank you, Abiade. I think I'm just going to jump into a few questions which were posed. So I'm hoping that I gain at least 15 more minutes because I'm going to answer a few questions before I start. So they talk about the issue was security, and Abiade mentioned one of the pillars, which was on security. There is the option of, in terms of vendor, multi-vendor, or vendor locking, one of the attributes of the cloud is that you shouldn't be locked into a particular vendor. So if you want to switch to another provider, you can build your infrastructure in such a way that you can easily migrate or move your applications onto a different cloud provider, or even to your own on-premises or private cloud. So one of the points was about compliance, and I'm going to try to address the compliance issue, but I'm going to do it from a hands-on perspective. So most of you will not be familiar with the AWS services, but the idea is that you should have an idea of what it takes to build a secure environment on AWS, and then how to use the infrastructure as code tools like Terraform or CloudFormation to provision a secure environment. So I'm just going to share my screen quickly. So I have what I chose to call a FinTech blueprint on AWS. So the idea is, how can you quickly deploy or provision an environment on AWS that allows you to securely host your financial applications and also to meet specific compliance requirements? Now, this document is available for download. I'm going to provide it to the host, and you should be able to download this and implement this on your own AWS account if you do have an account. Now, I'm just going to go into the technical details, and then I won't be building a FinTech application. I won't be provisioning any APIs, but just building the environment which gets to support your applications. Now, Abiade mentioned, let me just try to expand this. Okay. Abiade talked about regions and availability zones. So AWS provides you the concept of regions. So you have different regions. You have in Africa, you have in Cape Town, you have a region there. And within each region, you have availability zones. So an availability zone is like your own physical or private data center. But in this case, each availability zone is separate from the other availability zone. So what I'm going to do is create three environments in one AWS account, where I'm going to have an environment that connects to the customer. And then I'm going to have a management environment, and then an environment where developers can build applications. And then once they go through the traditional CI/CD process, it gets approved by management and then deployed into the customer-facing environment. So with this document, you should be able to do the same within your own AWS account. And now the idea is that at the end of setting up this environment, it should be compliant with the various industry regulations, especially in the FinTech environment. We're talking about PCI DSS, identity management, NIST, and various other best practices implemented by AWS. Now, let me be clear. I don't work for AWS. I use their services for my clients to build infrastructure. I also work with Azure. So most of these steps can also be replicated using Microsoft Azure or Google Cloud or any other provider out there. But I chose to focus on AWS for this presentation. And once you build that infrastructure, you should be able now to deploy various services, various AWS services to support your application. So for example, with provision a production virtual private cloud, this is dedicated to the customer facing side. I'm also going to deploy a management virtual private cloud, which includes subnets and private subnets, as well as an isolated subnet, which should house things like your databases. And then for the developers in your company, you can also have a separate VPC where you can try out stuff. And the main tool I'll be using to ensure compliance is what AWS calls AWS config. So with AWS config, you can check to make sure that all your storage, all your assets are encrypted, for example, or your password policy meets the best standard practices. Now, it's going to take about 15 minutes to provision all of these. So in between the provision, I'll be explaining some of the services which AWS provides. Now, all of these have automated these using what is known as the Cloud Development Kit. And the Cloud Development Kit uses a provisioning tool. So I'm sure most of you have heard about Terraform or CloudFormation. AWS provides CloudFormation, which helps you automate the provisioning of all your assets in the cloud. Now, there's some requirements. I'm just going to do a split screen here, just to. So let me just quickly go through these steps. Now, AWS provides what they call the AWS Cloud Shell. It's basically a terminal where you can use to provision your resources. You could use your computer, but you have to install certain applications just to be ready for that. For example, you need, for this to complete this lab, you need to install things like Node.js and NPM. I already have this installed to save time. And the first thing I'm going to do is export some of my credentials. Now, the Bootstrap service builds the foundational requirements to provision resources on AWS. Every AWS resource, you need the right level of authentication, the right role-based access control role and policies in order to deploy that service. Now, the AWS CDK Bootstrap is basically an automation tool that enables you to provision all the logins and the profiles you need to deploy resources on AWS. So why this is displayed, it's going to take a little while to deploy. Basically, I'm just specifying my account, this account ID, and then the region. So I'm deploying this environment in the EU West region. Now, if I were to go into the console, you discover that AWS provides you with a variety of regions. So depending on the country you are in, or the environment, or your regulatory requirements, you can choose in which region to host your applications. Now, we also have in Cape Town, which is currently the only available region on the African continent. And it also means that all your data will be stored in that environment. Now, what's happening here is that I'm using CloudFormation, which is an automation tool, to provision all the expected requirements for me to be able to access and build applications on AWS. You could do this manually, but it takes you a much longer time to complete it. Now, AWS provides you with CloudFormation. So what we've been doing is basically provisioning resources using CloudFormation. So if you want to see what has been configured, you can look into the template and then it describes everything that you've been doing. So basically, we have been creating keys, SSL keys, and encrypting storage. So all of this, for example, the KMS key is used to encrypt your data in AWS. And these are all permissions which allow me to be able to perform whatever operations I want to do in that storage environment. And this also describes, so after creating the resources, I can see which resources have been created. For example, if I were to provision a Docker container, I'll store the images in this repository. So all of this has been created in less than 5 minutes. If you were to do this manually, it will take you days and hours. But by automating the entire process, you can provision an entire AWS environment in a couple of minutes. So the next thing now, so that was just the foundational aspect. Now I will need to deploy the environment that configures my fintech architecture. So you can access all of this information from this GitLab repository, which will be shared to you after this presentation. Now, these scripts were built using an older version of NPM. So you might find a few errors because I'm using a much more advanced, a much more recent version. But using the force option, I can quickly ignore those errors and you still deploy the assets in the cloud. So this entire process should take about 15 minutes, but when it starts, I'll explain to you what's actually happening in the background. Now, I mentioned that CloudFormation is a tool like Terraform. CloudFormation, it allows you to automate the creation of resources on AWS. It's AWS-centric, but if you are worried about being tied to a particular vendor, you also can use Terraform, which allows you to do the same stuff on AWS. So Terraform is multi-vendor, so you can provision resources on AWS, you can provision resources on Google, or even within your own private cloud. So I choose to use CloudFormation here because it's much easier to demonstrate. Now, what's happening here is that these scripts are provisioning a virtual network environment. So if you have if you look at it from the perspective of a traditional private cloud or your own data center, you have your network environment, you have your subnets, you have your different subnets, different networks for different environments. So what's happening here is that we are provisioning three different virtual networks. We have a production environment, we have a development environment, and then we have a management environment. The idea is that if your engineers were to manage this infrastructure, they will have to be authenticated via VPN to the management environment and then be able to access both the development and production. So this addresses the aspect of security in some way. And the client VPN, so we're going to provision a client VPN, and then using the endpoint, you will now generate your keys, your private key, and the endpoint that you use and the certificate to access that AWS environment from your computer or from any other remote device. And then the most important thing which I'd like to talk about is what we call config packs. Now, these are different automated best practices that enable you to meet the requirements or expectations from regulations such as PCI DSS for financial services or NIST, which is a security standard, which is used extensively by the US government and the military, and it's been adopted by many organizations in the financial industry. And they also have best practices for storing your data on AWS Amazon S3, which is a storage service. Let's see what's happening. So this should take a few more minutes, and then the entire environment will be provisioned. I talk about DNS. AWS also provides the ability to host your own zone. And also, as Mark mentioned, it provides the ability for you to sign or do DNSSEC configurations and signatures. And so these are things which you can always read about on Amazon Route 53. And it gives you examples on how to provision that kind of configuration in your environment. Now, again, to make it simple, you also have access to the entire script. So you can go in here and modify things like your CI/CD DR block, change the name. So the script has been modularized that you can just modify it for your own environment. So once you understand how the AWS CloudFormation works, you can take this, deploy your own environment, and it's quite modular to support your specific environment. Now, to save time, while this is deploying, perhaps if there's any question up to this point, I could answer.
Any questions?
Yep, if any questions up to now, I can.
So feel free to type your questions in the chat section, and Hudson will be able to address them.
For some reason, I can't see the chat. Bashir?
No questions in the chat so
Okay.
far.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes. So once again, if you have any questions, please ask them in the chat section and we'll address them. I didn't say when you started, do you have like instances that are going to be managed, or it's serverless?
So it's up to you. So what I'm building here is more like the backbone. So you can then now go into, say, just pull up a service, for example. You can now go into, say, a service like EC2, and then deploy an instance in that environment you've created. So once it's done, I should be able to see the different virtual private networks, like the production environment. I can go and deploy, say, an Ubuntu server or service within the specific environment. So what I'm doing now is just building that architecture that enables you to be compliant for that particular industry. But then after that, you can go now and choose to provision, whether it's platform as a service, or you can use, for those who are into the microservice or Kubernetes, you can now go into the different services and provision your containers, for example, in that particular environment, in that specific virtual private network or in a subnet. Right? Mm-hmm. And so, yeah, so that's the whole idea, just to have that stable infrastructure, and then the developers can now go and then begin to provision serverless applications, or even using normal EC2 compute or Kubernetes, depending on whatever you're trying to provision, but all from a secure and compliant environment.
Okay, makes sense.
Now, AWS provides you with the config service. So this is where you're going to see which services or which environments are compliant. So in this case here, you have this dashboard that tells you, okay, this particular service, for example, NIST, your compliance score is 36. So then you can dive into that particular compliance requirement, and it's going to tell you which aspects of the environment are not compliant with that regulation. Now, for example, let me search for S3. So S3, we do have a couple of requirements. For example, it tells me there is no server-side encryption enabled on my S3 bucket. So I can click there and go to the specific S3 bucket that's not compliant. Just copy the bucket name. And one of the buckets which isn't compliant is this bucket, which has my VPN configuration. So what I can do is I can go into the bucket configuration, and the complaint is that it's not enabled for encryption. I believe that's encryption. Let's just check it out. I believe that should be encryption. Yes, so it's complaining of one of the complaints is about encryption. So what I can do is to enable encryption on that service. So once I enable encryption, I can then go back into the service and have it refresh itself to reassess the service to make sure that it's back in compliance mode. So the whole idea is that it gives you a clear picture of the different components that are not compliant with a particular regulation. So now the deployment is complete. So all of this has been done in about, let's say, 15 minutes or so. And now you can begin to look into the environment to say, okay, before developers can publish code or applications to the environment, you want to make sure that you're at least compliant with whatever your organization needs to be compliant with in that industry. And that's the use of the conformance packs, because then you can create different conformance requirements and then publish that in AWS, and then it will scan your system to make sure everything that you're doing is compliant. If you look critically, we've created a couple of services. Let's just go through them quickly. So I can go to the particular blueprint and look at the resources created. So yes, we've created a VPN for the network engineers. You can go to Virtual Private Cloud. And it describes the 3 different VPNs we created. Let me just show you the diagram. So this is the diagram we're looking at. So we have our production VPC, or management VPC, and development VPC. These have been created automatically using our scripts. So they're in different network environments, different subnets, different networks. And then you can go now into each VPC, and you can see the resources that have been created. For example, if you want to see the subnets created in this environment, I'll filter by VPC ID. And in this production environment, we've created automatically subnets for our databases. Now you see subnet 1, subnet 2. These are the different regions, different availability zones for redundancy. So meaning that if your environment in the first availability zone goes down, you still have access to your data in the second availability zone. AWS also provides you the option of having multi-region resources. So I can deploy subnets in databases in different regions, say in Cape Town or in Ireland or in the US, anyway, US East region, so that if if entire region is down, I still have access to my resources. Now, again, it also provisions automatically route tables and internet gateways if you need to access the internet. For security, you also have access to security groups, which enables you to filter what goes in and out of your environment. Now, this is just a high-level overview of how you can quickly provision a secure fintech environment on AWS. We've looked at config maps, config services, which allow you to verify compliance with the different regulations. And so there's also aspects of encryption, which allows you to encrypt your data in the cloud. So for those who are very security conscious, you can encrypt the data in the cloud, but also keep your own keys, which ensures that only you can access your data, not even the cloud provider or the engineers working for that cloud provider. So I think I've exceeded my time. I'm going to take a few questions and then we wrap it up for the day.
So thank you, Hudson, for the tutorial and the demonstration. If we have any questions, please type them in the chat section, or you can raise up your hand and we'll allow you to speak.
Stephen, Kwame. Bashir, I think Stephen raised his hand.
I asked him to unmute.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
I just want to say thank you very much for such an insightful, practical presentation session. Unfortunately, I didn't join early because of some internet hitches, but the few I have been able to grab is quite insightful, and I just want to thank you for that. I have a little concern if you could use your experience and expertise to address. In my environment, we currently migrating most of our infrastructure and services to the cloud. We are heavily dependent on Microsoft. I mean, so we are running services like the AD. We are currently thinking of deploying Enterprise Outlook to manage our mailing system and stuff like that. Looking at various cloud technologies, I mean, we may want to say the AWS is perfectly as or even more from preference or from choice point of view will be chosen over some cloud service providers. I want to ask if it is very comfortable and compatible to deploy a service like AD in an AWS cloud environment, and will you advise that, or you will prefer you go with Microsoft cloud?
Again, so it comes down to your, like Abiade mentioned in the cloud adoption framework, it comes down to many things. It starts from the business case. So you want to look at what suits your business or answers the question that your business wants to solve, the problem your business wants to solve. Now, if you're highly dependent on tools like Microsoft Active Directory, of course, AWS provides. So AWS provides Active Directory, and they also provide the Active Directory service that is compliant with your Microsoft Active Directory. So there are integration APIs that enable you to able to use your on-premises Active Directory forest within AWS or migrate that to AWS itself. So again, it comes down to what business problem you're trying to solve, because if you look at it critically, across the different providers, they provide similar services and similar integration points. So you need to figure out which will meet your need or your business need the most. And of course, there are other different vectors you can explore. But in terms of most of the SaaS services being offered by different vendors, most of them are supported on AWS or Microsoft Azure, or actually even Google Cloud. So I don't know if I answered the question.
Yeah, I think if it's not been clarified, you can just type in the chat section, please. I think at this point, Hudson, I'd like to thank you for your presentation.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. It was great. Thank you.
Thanks. So I'd like to, as usual, provide us feedback, right? We've shared a link in the chat. Bhavna shared a link in the chat section.